The nightmare came again. Laura moaned in her sleep and mouthed the words "no. No. No." In her dream she was in New Orleans in the French Quarter. He was there smiling. A dark Creole man about 50. He walked towards her with a grin under a thin mustache that was as sharp as a carving knife. She tried to move, but she couldn't. The ground under her feet was like grasping hands from a grave. He drew closer and his smile widened so she could see his crooked yellow teeth and darting red tongue. His gaunt and evil face grew larger and larger and seemed to threaten to swallow her up, leaving her to disappear in the darkness of his mouth. Her scream woke up her husband. "That stupid dream again," he said with growing impatience, tired of his wife's silly nightmares. "I can't help it, David. Do you think I want to be haunted in my sleep and dreams like this? My life has become a nightmare. Tomorrow we see a colleague, Professor Gilbert." As Barbara opened her mouth to protest, he continued, "It's not open to discussion." She nodded submissively. She desperately wanted to please her husband. He was her world and held her life together after her parents had both died in car wreck 3 months ago in New Orleans. "But please come with me." He shrugged. "If you wish." Like Dr. Gilbert, he too was a professor of psychology at their university. Barbara checked herself out before her mirror. She always needed to look her best. She was a medium height, with a great figure and legs, and men had always loved her long blonde hair. She looked even younger than her 22. But her blue eyes looked haunted. Barbara knew she had always been pampered and protected by her rich parents, but they were gone. Now she only had her husband to cling to. Dr. Gilbert listened patiently to her recital of her nightmares. "I think it is obvious, your fear of evil stalking you. It's due to your parents' death on vacation in New Orleans. Their death had to be a tremendous shock." Barbara couldn't deny it. "What can we do, Dr. Gilbert?" "I think it's obvious, Dr. Walters." Barbara must face down her fears. She needs to go to New Orleans and dispel this silly bogeyman from her dreams. "Good idea, sir," enthused David. Barbara almost screamed in her terror to this crazy plan. "I won't do it," she said stubbornly. Her husband took her by her shirt and his grip was so strong that she almost cried out, "You will go and that's that." "Understand." Submissively she nodded. All her life she wished her will was stronger. "You've got to promise me you won't leave me alone in the city, especially in the French Quarter." He nodded and kissed her. "Thanks for being so agreeable." Barbara grimaced. That was the story of her life, being agreeable. They flew in and stayed at the Royal Orleans. Barbara had begged for a hotel outside the French Quarter, but both her husband and Dr. Gilbert thought it would be better for her to overcome her fears if they stayed at the center of her irrational nightmares. Barbara had to admit the last 6 days before they arrived she had no more of those horrible nightmares and begged David to just cancel the trip, but he refused. "I'm glad you're better, but it just goes to show that facing your fears is way to go. But we can't stop now or you will probably backslide." Again in their suite the dreams did not come and she had a good night's sleep. They went out and walked along amused as the sidewalks and streets were being hosed down and bums and drunks were being picked up in wheelbarrows. They had great lunch at a local restaurant. That night they walked arm in arm down Bourbon St. Barbara, dressed especially sexy for her man, a short red leather skirt and a tight blouse and his favorite black high-heel boots. She smiled when he praised her beauty, after a superb dinner at Antoine's, which they could easily afford as both Barbara and David had mucho money. Then David dropped his bomb. "I want you to walk back to the hotel alone." Barbara started crying and begged to return with him. Her heart raced with the fear of being alone in the city of her nightmares. David shook his head. No. But why not? She wanted to pound his chest. He surely couldn't do this to her. Both Dr. Gilbert and I feel you must face your fears alone at least for a short time. Barbara had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. But you promised me you wouldn't leave me alone. She was openly crying, but he looked away from her tears. I know, and I meant it at the time, but Dr. Gilbert feels very strongly about this, so I'm afraid I will have to go back on my word. Sorry. But it's only 6 short blocks to the hotel and I want you to walk it. No taxi. I will be waiting for you right outside the entrance. Her mouth was wide with fright and anger. She watched her husband shamefaced hop into a taxi. It's really for your own good, sweetheart. Barbara stood paralyzed. Then, fighting back her tears, she started walking, which was uncomfortable in her 4-inch heels, and her boots rang on the uneven sidewalk. Barbara had been afraid to mention it to David, but she felt that the city, especially the French Quarter, seemed to be drenched in centuries of evil. She hurried along, ignoring as best she could the discomfort of the boots. And I wore them for him, she thought, with tears in her eyes. I won't forgive David to this, she vowed. But she knew she would. It was an empty threat. Then she saw him. The man of her nightmares. The dark man with the razor-sharp mustache above a cruel face. He smiled at her, and it was like the smile of a predatory bird. She gasped in fright and desperately looked around for her husband. He wasn't there. The dark man walked closer and his feet made no sound. She dashed to the other side of the street and he did the same. He was stalking her. His smile grew in size and cruelty and satisfaction. She saw the crooked, sharp yellow teeth of her nightmares and turned and ran blindly. Turning a corner of a side street, she gasped. He was there. Somehow he had gotten in front of her. She pivoted and desperately ran. A storefront was on her left and Barbara dove into it and moved to the back, huddling in the crowd. Great, she had lost him. She felt an insidious touch on her elbow. Despite herself, she turned and stared into the evil, smiling face that haunted her dreams. He opened his mouth to smile wider and she saw the crooked yellow teeth, and his breath was faded and foul like that of a tiger after devouring its prey. Barbara tried to scream but couldn't. Blindly she ran from the store, knocking people out of the way. Her boots' heels rattled like a startled deer's hooves. Somehow she made it outside. People stared as she ran desperately for safety. Lady, what wrong? Asked a kindly man, but she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. She had to get away. The hotel and David in safety were only a few blocks, she hoped. A cab cruised by and she jumped in. It had another passenger. Horrified, she stared at the man of her nightmares. She made a gasping sound in her throat, desperately seeking air to breathe, to live. Somehow she made it out of the taxi and into Jackson Square. She ran through the foliage, sweat was a river down her skin. Then he grabbed her just before she reached the hotel. She clawed at him, but he ignored her and irresistibly pulled her to him. His vile kiss devoured her screams. The world whirled and disappeared. The night was gone, everything was gone. She was being swallowed up. The whirlpool took everything from her. She was gone, swallowed in the black abyss of his kiss. When Barbara came back to consciousness, she found herself being carried on a stretcher towards an ambulance's flashing lights. Relax, said a soothing medical voice. You're going to be okay. Barbara was startled. She was in front of the hotel and there was yes, it was David, Why did she have so much trouble remembering him? Her mind was in a fog. All she could remember clearly was the dreadful, nightmarish kiss. David was just standing there like a dummy. Why doesn't he come over and comfort me and see how I am? Then she saw a beautiful blonde girl, wearing a red leather skirt and black boots, guide up to him and take his arm. David smiled down at her. What the hell? The lovely girl looked hauntingly familiar. Barbara should know who she was, yes, but who was she? The beautiful girl smiled widely and happily and showed perfect teeth, and when she looked towards Barbara, her smile widened like a cat that eaten a covey of canaries. She pressed her sexy body closer to David. A terrified Barbara caught her reflection in the doctor's examined mirror. Barbara saw an ugly old face with a slit of a mustache with crooked yellow teeth. The doctor said, "God, when the last time you brushed your teeth, sir?" To her. To her. Then her mind cleared. It was her nightmare made horribly real. Barbara started screaming and screaming. The ambulance doors closed on her screams. Inside the ambulance, even through the steel doors, the screams continued. They sounded like they would never stop as the vehicle drove off into the night. Away from the hotel and the handsome young couple by the doors. The beautiful girl tuned to David. "Thank you, darling, for making me come to New Orleans and face my fears. I feel like a new woman. I've been born again. I can't thank you and Dr. Gilbert enough. Thank you, thank you. It's made such a difference in my life. I'm sure I will have no more nightmares." Barbara laughed a charming laugh. "In fact, I feel like a new woman.